Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another episode of The Partial Historians. Join us as we trace the history of Rome from the founding of the city. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. Welcome.
So, Dr. G, we are edging our way close to what is largely considered to be a momentous time for Rome. But before we get any further in that journey, what happened last time we were speaking?
Oh, last time. It was a big time.
Yeah.
The Romans, they're doing lots of things. They've finally decided that maybe they should seek outside advice for building a code of laws. They're like, you know what? If we're going to write the laws down, maybe other people have written the laws down. Maybe we should check in.
The law about the laws.
The law about the laws.
Yeah.
We're getting closer. And finally the patricians have agreed. The Senate is like, let's send a delegation of ex-consuls out to Athens to ask them about their law code.
And this has been about a decade in the making. I mean, not for us, for the Romans. It's been about a decade in the making since they first started talking about writing down their law code so that it's not just seemingly the patricians that know what the rules and customs are that are guiding their society. So this is a pretty big deal.
This is huge.
Yeah.
And we're finally seeing some movement on it, which suggests that the people at the top are finally taking note of the pressure from below, which has been coming from the tribunes and the plebeians for quite a long time, that they want some transparency. Please, I just want to know where I stand.
Yeah. So,
and
yeah, I mean, this conflict of the orders has been going on for so long, but it's really only been in the last sort of 10 years that we've seen this real demand about the codification of the laws, and they've gone off to Athens, I believe, to look at the Code of Solon.
It seems a bit out of date, but I'll let them... That's okay.
Hey, what else do they have to refer to? I mean...
Well, the thing is that if we're in around about 454 BCE, we're talking the time of Pericles.
True, that's true, yeah.
The laws of Solon, they're nice and all, but they're not the thing that Athens is currently really rigorously doing, necessarily.
This is true.
So are we getting some, retrojections in our narrative about, what is good Greek stuff to hold on to?
Oh, I definitely want to get into this, but for now, I just want to recap the one final thing that we talked about last episode. So within this conflict of the orders, there emerges occasionally a hero of the underdog, the plebeians.
The man born with teeth.
Exactly. Last time we were talking about the Roman Achilles a little bit. I mean, he's been doing some
amazing stuff.
Cagey, but amazing stuff. And we dealt with the aftermath of that last episode, which was the consuls actually being held to account for seemingly not doing the right thing with the spoils of war.
Yeah, and so we see the rise of Sikius from military subordinate and man of daring do on the battlefield to going into politics and trying to hold the big man to account.
Yeah,
it's impressive stuff.
This guy, Sikius Dentatus, has been... In your account, at least, a major
It's
figure.
been very impressive in my account. Impressive. Thank you, Dionysius.
And as a result of what he did in your account, and seemingly it's for a completely different reason in my account, the consuls ended up actually being fined quite greatly in the last episode that we were talking about. So there's definitely some sense that finally change is happening, maybe. But
baby steps.
Baby steps. But it's a whole new year, Dr. G. So what year are we in now?
It is 453 BC.
Okay, so that means we've got some new consuls. Now, my consuls are Publius Curiatius and Sextus Quintilius. No. It's that... I always want to insert an I where there isn't one. Oh, no, there is one. No, okay, I did say it correctly. Never mind.
Yeah, look, I concur.
That was seamless.
Seamless, very seamless. Yeah, we've got two consuls. Yeah, I agree. We've got Publius Curiatius. We're not sure who he's the son of or who he's the grandson of, but he also is given a couple of additional names.
Which I didn't want to say because I feel like I'll be really childish.
But one of them is Fistus. So that tells you everything you need to know about him.
Yeah.
And Trigeminus.
Yeah.
Or Trigeminus or...
something like that, yeah.
Anyway, one of those things. He's a patrician. No surprises there.
Yeah,
Our other is Sextus Quintilius.
Yes.
Son of Sextus, grandson of Publius. And in sort of quotation marks or question marks, Varus might be another name that he possesses.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah, also a patrician.
All right. So I am going to flag that once again, Livy's not giving me a huge amount of detail this year. However, I feel like that's because it is a bit of a quiet year. I feel like that's going to be a common thing amongst both our accounts. I could be overstepping because, you know, you really surprised me with all the Roman Achilles dentata stuff. But in my account, it's actually a very quiet year because the tribunes are actually fine, just hanging out because they're waiting for the return of this commission that has been sent to look at the Code of Solon in Athens.
I see. They're like, let's just chill and wait for the response.
Well, yeah. So there's not a lot of conflict, therefore, because of, you know, between the consuls and the tribunes because of that. And it also apparently was a really grim year all the way around. Apparently, according to Livy, this was a year of famine and pestilence. Really, really bad, affecting men and animals. So bad that people apparently, you know, aren't really able to do their usual work on the farms and that sort of thing. There's just lots of funerals happening. It's striking rich and poor equally. And there are some really important people who are struck down. So the Flamen of Quirinus, apparently, one Servius Cornelius is dead. The augur Gaius Horatius Publius. No, wait, sorry. I'm having real trouble with names with V's in them today. Gaius Horatius Pulvillus.
Oh.
Apparently also is struck down. And finally, one of the consuls, Sextus Quintilius, is also struck down, as along with 4 of the tribunes of the plebs. And this is really the detail that I am getting in Livy. It's just about
It's
death.
just a list of names of dead people.
It's just,
oh, God.
It's just death. And luckily for them, apparently there's no external conflict going on either. Maybe because this is something that's happening, you know, in the region. But yeah, it just seems to be a year of gloomy non-action.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, it sounds like mostly we've got a parallel here.
Okay.
But Dionysius of Halicarnassus puts in a little bit of zest.
Of course he does.
To spice things up.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing quite like a pestilence, is there?
Well, I mean, this does tie into what we've been saying all along, which is that by the time we get to the middle of this century that we're dealing with, academics are fairly certain that Rome was going through a really tough time. They're fairly sure that it was economically not great because there's not a lot of temple building going on. That sort of peters out in, I think, around the 480s. And there's basically very little Greek pottery seemingly being imported. There's like no remains for this time. And it's around 450, 440, so it seems to get really serious. And that they're pretty sure there is definitely famine and tough times that people are going through. So it makes sense that it's reflected, at least to some degree, in Livy and Dionysius.
Yeah, and we get this sense, I think our perception of like just the massive consequences implied by a pestilence has really been magnified recently as well. So this narrative, I think, is really going to hit home in the sense that Dionysius talks about how almost all of the slaves die.
Wow.
And he also notes that about 1/2 of the citizens' lives are lost.
Wow.
And we can go back to Livy's census records. Actually, he notes that obviously there's huge questions about whether we should trust any of these figures.
I think we should always trust Livy, Dr. G.
I'm just flagging that that we're really not sure as historians the accuracy of any of the numbers before it's sort of like the late 3rd century.
Yeah.
But we're in the 5th century at the moment, and Livy noted that in 459 there was a census taken, and that the census numbered 117,319 citizens.
I remember it well.
Yeah, that's a very specific number. Thank you, Livy. So we're talking about a loss on that calculation. If we could take that number from Livy and apply it to what Dionysius is telling us here, that we're looking at a loss of life of about 50,000 people.
Which is absolutely huge.
Which is absolutely huge. And that's not even accounting for the fact that They also suggest that most of the slave population is taken out by this pestilence.
And they wouldn't be included in the census.
They weren't included in the census, and chances are they outnumber the citizens, even in this time period.
Yeah.
So
that's a big question, of course. We don't really know how many slaves there are in Rome at this point in time, but we certainly get their presence being attested, in little bits and pieces throughout the sources. So definitely, I would agree, there's a significant number of people here. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about a massive loss of life. And usually one of the things that happens immediately when you come across a pestilence in your written material is people always want to know, well, what was it?
Yes.
Can we identify what this pestilence was? Some kind of disease? What kind of virus? What are the consequences of it? And usually it's not possible to tell from the written record.
Yeah.
These people are too far away from the thing from when it happened. Yeah. And they also don't have the rigorous sort of medical framework that we use today. So they will often give you a sense of some of the symptoms.
Yeah.
And you still won't be able to really narrow it down because they're quite common. And we just don't know. So we know that people are dying. It seems to be also killing animals. There is discussion about husbandmen. So the people who work with flocks, they're falling ill and their animals are also falling ill. So it spreads, and it seems to, in Dionysius' account, he seems to suggest that it starts in the city and flows out into the countryside.
Oh, because I was going to say, it almost sounds like, it does sound like a bit of a COVID-19 parallel in that it sounds a bit like it's coming from animals and spreading to people, but if it comes from the city first...
Yeah, no, they seem to, he seems to suggest that it's starting in the city, or at least they notice it in the city, and then they notice it in the countryside.
Right.
We don't know which way around this is going.
Well, because of course, in the city, like again in the COVID-19 situation, it probably spreads way more quickly and there's more people around to notice. So it's very possible that it came in from the countryside, transmitted somehow with someone bringing in their wares or whatever in a market or something like that. And then you see it take off in the city because you've got people living in much closer quarters.
Yeah. And part of the trouble seems to be as well that it's super contagious. So people start off trying to help people when they get sick.
Sure.
Then they catch it and then they die.
Right.
And when people start to see that pattern, they then start to just abandon people to die.
Yeah.
So this becomes pretty bad because you could fall ill in the initial sort of wave, and then your family tries to help you. They all fall ill. And then in secondary scenarios from that point onwards, people are just abandoning their homes and leaving people to die. And then going back and retrieving the bodies afterwards.
Yeah.
This means that there's also a lot of bodies. And this is a huge additional sort of public health issue.
Absolutely.
To have this many bodies, because what do you do with them? Where do you put them?
Yeah.
They
Not inside the city. I know that much.
Sorry?
Not inside the city.
No, it can't be inside the pomerium. That is forbidden. We don't know how much they're paying attention to the pomerium at this point.
I would imagine that the Romans are... I actually didn't check this because this wasn't mentioned in my account. They just said, lots of funerals are taking place. But I would imagine by this stage the Romans are already cremating their dead.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they do that up until a certain point, until there's too many.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the rate of death starts to outpace their capacity to do cremation.
Oof.
And
which is sounding really grim.
It is really grim. Then they start to go for mass burials.
Right.
That becomes overburdened very quickly as well.
Yeah.
And then they start to throw bodies into the river.
Oh, no.
This is terrible.
That's a terrible idea.
Terrible idea. As they find out almost immediately.
How? I mean, even I understand that they don't have the understanding of medicine and the way the body works and the way disease spreads that we do now. But at what point is having a dead body in your water source a good idea? I mean,
it's a terrible idea. Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah. But if one person is kind of like, well, I need to get rid of this body, I'm just going to do it, it's just one body, it's a huge river, she'll be right. You look at the Tiber, it's reasonably wide, you're like, the river's not going to notice, and it's flowing that way. It's flowing away from the city. The fresh water is coming from the mountains over there.
Right.
It's going to be okay. They're mistaken about this. The bodies start to wash back up again.
Oh, God.
In a worse state than when they were put in.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. The stench is apparently terrible. And that also has health consequences because this is the river that they drink from.
Yeah.
There is a sort of a really complex spring system within Rome as well of natural springs.
Sure.
So not all water sources are tainted, but certainly people drinking from the river are also now getting sick. for other reasons.
Yeah. Oh, that's so disgusting. Ugh.
It is pretty gross.
I've honestly got goosebumps on my arm. Look at it.
That was true. Goodness me. So this is a really bad time for Rome, and Dionysius does not shy away from these details at all.
Mm-hmm.
Talks about the contagion with the sheep and the other animals. So letting us know that it's spreading into the countryside from his perspective.
Yes.
They become so concerned that they try to develop new rituals in order to appease the gods, because clearly there's a huge rupture with the Pax Deorum.
I know. I was going to say, I'm actually really surprised that Livy doesn't talk more about that angle, especially because we've got a Flamen dying and an Augur dying. And he talks a lot, he does mention a lot about, this is something that the great families, and I'm presuming he means patricians there, are suffering here. So I'm surprised there isn't more talk about the religious angle. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, this does come into play a little bit for Dionysius.
Yeah.
So they start sacrificing and doing expiations and creating innovative ritual processes, apparently. But when these don't seem to have an effect on the course of the pestilence, they're really abandoned quite quickly. And also, obviously, people like priests are also unwell. So who's going to be doing the ritual process anyway?
Course. Yeah.
I have some terrible news for you. Obviously, you know that Sextus Quintilius dies. So one of our consuls dies.
Yes.
He's replaced by a Suffolk consul.
Yes, I do know about this, but please tell me anyway.
Our Suffolk consul, tragically, is Spurius Furius.
I know, I was so excited to see his name.
He returns briefly.
But then he also dies.
Yeah, he does not last long.
Let's have a moment of silence for Spurius Furius.
The tragedy.
We will miss your name. And the only thing that gives me comfort in this time is that the Romans keep naming everybody the same thing.
We're going to be lucky because there will be more Spurii Furii. That is the great hope.
That is my hope.
Did he have a son? Praise be.
Yeah.
Poor Spurius Furius. So he gets bumped off as well. I get 4 tribunes, which I think corresponds to the number in Livy.
Oh my god, a number matching up. That almost never happens.
Incredible.
I know.
And many worthy senators.
Yeah. Which, to be fair, could be plebeians too. We're not really sure at this time. It's more likely that they're patricians. But
it seems pretty unlikely they'd be plebeians at this stage.
It does. But it's possible there are some academics out there that think there is a mix.
Certainly. And we need to hold on to that possibility for the next few years at least, because that will become important.
Yeah, but I
hold
agree
that
with you.
factoid in mind, listeners.
It does seem more likely that they are patricians.
It seems pretty likely.
Yeah.
But you never ever know.
You never know.
Meanwhile, out in the wilds of the rest of Italy, the Aequians seize this as an opportunity.
Interesting, because I have got a deliberate mention that Rome's enemies do not attack in this year. Interesting. Okay.
Oh, but they think about it.
Oh, okay.
Boy.
Okay.
Oh boy.
Okay.
They think about it. They're like, this is going to be great. The Romans are really on the back foot with this pestilence.
Yeah.
Let's get in there. So they send envoys out to everybody who's also hostile to Rome, being like, we've noticed that they're not ready to fight.
See, I'm just going to say one thing to the Aequians right now. Social distancing. I mean, have you heard of it?
Yeah.
If it's a pestilence, I don't think you want to be getting up and close with Romans in any capacity.
And maybe it only affects Romans. I'm an Aequian. It's going to be fun. I'm not wearing a mask. Anyway, this doesn't go well for them.
Yeah.
Because it turns out that they start to lead their forces out of the city, and they're making their preparations, and they're marching through the countryside, and guess where the pestilence is?
In
the countryside.
Yeah.
So, no surprises. Their armies get sick. The pestilence then falls upon their soldiery, which then they take back to their cities, and then all of a sudden Aequians and all the rest of the hostiles to the Romans also catch the pestilence.
At the risk of dating our podcast even further, I feel like there's a lesson in there somewhere, Dr. G.
Yes. Well, isolation could be useful.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Well, it's interesting because I am going to go off on a slight tangent here because we're talking about pestilence and all, but it is interesting. I have listened to a few podcasts and read a few articles and that sort of thing about, as I'm sure anybody with interest in history has, about plagues and pestilence of times past. And it is interesting that one of the things that has often been practiced as a remedy is isolation and social distancing. And obviously, sometimes that's practiced in really horrible and cruel ways, but at the same time, it is effective for diseases that are highly contagious.
It is. And you begin to see people very readily start to practice it when they see the consequences of the contagion themselves.
Yeah.
It usually takes some visual evidence. The trouble with that is that if you've had the visual evidence, you also may have been too close and you may have also already caught the contagion.
Yes.
So there is this really complex mechanism because we've got this idea that Dionysius is flagging that people see what happens when you hang out with people who have caught the pestilence, and then they start to abandon people. And that is effectively a self-imposed isolation where you're like, you know what, I'm staying away from all of those sick people because I do not want to get that thing.
And that's the cruel way of doing it. Obviously, we would hope that these days people, as I think a lot of people are helping out the more vulnerable members of communities in a way that's safe for themselves and safe for that person. But there are ways of doing it. But of course, I totally understand in this time period where you don't really understand disease the way that we understand it, and you therefore aren't really going to have those safety measures in place.
Yeah, and it's really tricky to know how you should best save yourself or protect yourself from this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Without a real understanding of how, contagion operates.
And you also, even if you understood it, you don't have hand sanitizer and things like that. So can you actually protect yourself?
And you should not wash in the river.
No.
Do not recommend.
Splish splash, I was taking a bath.
Oh, something bumped to the stuff. So don't do that. So it seems that it spreads to the land of the Aequians, the land of the Volscians, and the Sabines.
Well, that's handy. That's knocking out all of Rome.
Very convenient for Rome, I must say. The gods are certainly working in their favour.
Explains how Livy got to the place that he did.
Part of the big consequence for this whole pestilence, though, for the people that remain, is that because of the nature of it and just how many people were involved and the complexities in trying to navigate that and stay alive, is that the land doesn't get cultivated. So
that's definitely something Livy mentions as well.
Yeah, and this means that this is something that I think in this modern era where we find ourselves sort of like largely detached from the process of food and the production of it and the whole chain of how it comes into being.
I mean, anything. Clothing.
Yeah.
I mean, everything is just so easy to access for people in our situation. Not everybody around the world, but...
No, but if you're living in a relatively wealthy country and you have access to the internet, chances are you're very removed from all of the processes that go into producing any particular good, food or otherwise.
Yeah.
But in something like ancient Rome, if you don't till the field and if you don't plant the crop, next year you don't have food to eat.
Yeah. And I think that's actually something that I worry about for our society, about us being too detached from that process, because I think we do have an illusion of plenty because of the way that capitalism and consumerism have shaped our society and our world. And it's not that it's enjoyable in the moment, but I do really worry about us being so detached from this process of where our things come from and what it takes to make these things, and the fact that we really need to start waking up to the fact that it is not a never-ending supply.
Yeah, there is only so much that can be produced.
Yeah, and the way that we're producing stuff is so damaging to the environment that we really, I mean, even putting aside something like climate change, which obviously is threatening our existence as a whole, but the way that we are farming and the way that we are burning through resources and our population rising, it is actually a real concern. So even though it's horrible to read about these sorts of things in ancient Rome, I do think there is, in a sense, a harsh benefit to people actually having to face the reality of what these sorts of events entail. Because I worry that we are facing crises in this world now, and we can't
even see them coming.
We can't. That's the problem. That's why there's not more action being demanded and taken. Although there are people out there who, you know, I mean, so grateful for the people who put themselves out there for causes that are worth fighting for all the time. And, you know, particularly, you know, school strike activists, you know, well done you. But not enough people are yet on that bandwagon, actively out there demanding for change. And I think it's because of this illusion that it's not something that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, and as long as you can easily gain the supplies that you need, then you don't have to ask that many questions. No. And for the Romans, this is really front and center because they can see the coming famine.
Absolutely.
You know, the people who live through this pestilence are well aware that the fields have not been cultivated.
Yeah.
That what comes next is a season where you don't have produce and you've got to find another way to acquire it.
And of course, living through a time of plague, being malnourished just makes you more vulnerable.
It's not great.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like this, like there's the first hit and then there's the second punch, which is like, welcome to famine. So that concludes 453 for me.
Yeah.
Which means that we can roll on into 452 BC.
I've got about another 5 sentences for you, Dr. G. All right.
I'm very excited to hear all of them.
Are you interested in ancient history and the occasional pun? If so, Ancient History Hound is for you. Hi, my name's Neil, and I'm the host of Ancient History Hound, a podcast which covers a range of topics across ancient Greece and Rome. Whether you're someone new to it all or a seasoned veteran, I've got you covered. Find Ancient History Hound wherever you get your podcasts from. Alternatively, visit my website, ancientblogger.com, or find me on Twitter @ancientblogger.
Okay, so let's start off 452 new consuls. Okay, now I think there's going to be a bit of controversy about some of the namings here, but the ones that Livy names, Gaius Menenius, we've heard that name before, as in the Menenius part, and Publius Cestius Capitolinus. Now, I think that it's the Menenius that there might be some different names for, as in...
Yeah, what did you say is Gaius?
I believe there might be some alternatives.
Yeah, look, Gaius didn't even come up in my record. He's called Lucius Menenius or Titus Menenius.
Titus is the one I was expecting you to say. So.
Yeah. He has many names, and he is the son of Agrippa and the grandson of Agrippa, Lenatus, apparently. A patrician. And then I think we pretty much agree on Publius Cestius, son of Quintus, the grandson of Vibulus, Capitolinus Vaticanus. Ooh. Sounds like he comes from the hill across the river, you know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying, Dr. G.
Another patrician.
Yes.
It's very exciting because these two consuls are like, okay, it's a disaster. We've just had this whole plague happen.
Absolutely.
The pestilence seems to peter out.
It's very convenient the way they only last for 1 year.
Yes. Narratively convenient.
Yeah.
But it might make sense because the consuls come in about May.
Right.
So in Northern Hemisphere, we're talking the weather is warming up, things are kind of nice.
Sure.
You expect pestilences to be more vigorous and difficult to combat in cold weather when people are more indoors.
That's true.
Whereas when you're outside in the sunshine, you can run away from people with a plague. You're like, oh,
run away.
Hot-footed over here. Don't want to hang out with those guys.
Okay, so in my account, once again, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there is no external threat. Probably because everyone is dealing with the aftermath of this pestilence.
Can't stand up. Yeah. Can't fight. Got no grain.
Finally, some common sense. However, Dr. G, we are so tantalizingly close to this big moment we've been edging our way towards. And there are signs of change afoot.
Ooh.
Disturbances are arising on the home front, and that's because the people that went on holiday to Athens to check out that law code that they have over there are back.
Turns out the pestilence didn't make it to Greece. Praise be!
Oh yeah, they're back, baby. They're back. Does that happen in your account as well?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
certainly things of that nature. There are definitely more things that happen.
Well, I've got a little bit more, not a lot, so strap in. Okay, so of course, with the commission from Athens being back, the tribunes now are starting to ramp up. And they're starting to say, okay, we were patient. You said you wanted to check out this other law code. That has been done. The time has come.
You can run away from your responsibilities no longer.
Yeah, exactly. So they start talking actually seriously about how they're going to actually do this. Okay. Now, before
this sounds almost unfeasible. Like, just wait, listeners, because this has been a decade in the making.
Yeah.
Are they actually going to do something?
Well, definitely there seems to be a concession being made that, yes, we are going to make a step towards this. Yeah, I know. And they decide that a way that they could do this would be to appoint decemvirs, or 10 men, who would have special rights. There would be no appeal against them, and there would be no other magistrates for that year whilst they were in play.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah. There's a bit of a debate, though, that arises because there is a question about whether these should all be patricians or whether plebeians should actually be allowed to take part in this. Now, before I go any further, I do have a little bit more detail on that, but before I go any further, I do want to flag some things.
Please do.
Okay.
I'm sensing flags.
Yeah. So, first of all, we said at the beginning of this episode that we were going to flag this whole idea of going to Athens to check out another law code.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to talk about that now.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
So, you're totally right in saying that it's a bit surprising that they would go to these lengths. And that's because there are, not just because, as you say, Solon is a little bit of time ago.
Yeah. You know.
But it's also because there are Greek colonies in southern Italy.
Yeah, you don't have to go far. Just go on a summer holiday south.
No. So there's a question mark there about whether you actually need to go to Athens.
Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm being sent away on a commission to talk to Greeks, I'm obviously going to Athens.
So that seems a bit suspicious. It seems as though maybe our sources are trying to echo some stuff that happened in Greece in their accounts of what is happening at Rome.
How convenient.
Exactly. And I imagine that this is something that you also would get having a Greek source, or like something that would also be something that Dionysius is interested in, because he seems constantly interested in drawing connections between Greece or Greek culture and customs and Rome. Is he going down this track as well?
Look, it doesn't feel like it in a particularly strong way, but
Yeah.
I'll wait, because I'm interested in where this is going from your perspective.
Yeah.
To see to what degree Dionysius is really matching up with this.
Yeah. Well, I guess the thing is that there seems to be a pattern where there's a sense of crisis amongst an aristocracy. And this then leads to legislation. Now, we've been talking about this legislation for a while. It's like a big milestone that's happening. But the weird thing about it is, as we'll see when we get to it, so I won't go into too much detail now, it doesn't entirely really seem to address the issues that we've been talking about for all this time. I mean, yes, they do seem to be written down. So, okay, check.
Definitely some stuff gets written down. Is it the stuff that we're expecting to get written down? Largely no.
Exactly. So it seems as though what's potentially happening here is, yes, there is a certain concession being made to a certain extent, but it's probably actually more the aristocracy trying to preserve their power.
That is a big surprise, I have to say.
Shocking, I know, yeah. And the legislation, therefore, it's not really a win for the plebeians.
Yeah, look, I put it to you that if you have a 10-man group taking absolute power and no other magistrates are allowed to hold power for that entire year, then somebody, don't want to suggest who, but somebody might be missing out on some representation at law.
Yeah. So, and then when you look at the 12 tables, they don't really show a strong similarity with the law code of Solon.
devastating. They went and found the ideas and they're like, you know what? No.
Yeah, so it almost seems as though this is a made-up thing.
Something fishy is going on.
Yeah, most academics that I have read don't really believe that there was a trip to Athens. I'm sorry to say.
That is very disappointing
Yeah.
because that is what I'm living for right now.
Yeah, so yes, I'm just going to flag that doesn't seem to have really happened. And yeah, it does seem to be trying to draw connections to Greece for some reason, and also trying to echo a larger pattern of, you know, a time of crisis. You know, you got to move away from a certain type of government, monarchy, etc. And then there's a certain crisis that happens, and then the legislation is coming out of that crisis.
And I think this is the thing as well that it's worth keeping in mind, is that the Greeks and the Romans have some pretty clear ideas that they develop later on, from in the 2nd and the 1st century BCE, about political theory and how governance operates, and the cycles of it. And one of the famous ones that most students of history have looked into is Polybius, who talks about a cyclical nature to the way that governance works.
Absolutely.
And you come around into various crises that lead to another particular thing, and that works for a while until the next crisis, which inevitably leads to this thing. And it's positioned as there's a very clear sequential rotation through a cycle of types of government, followed by a subsequent crisis, which presages the next part coming in.
Absolutely.
And so this idea that you switch from a monarchy into a republic, obviously there's a crisis in between that, and to go from something that is ruled by an oligarchy into something that's more democratic, you've got to have another crisis. And so are we just seeing a layer of narrative onto this sort of past, which is kind of dimly understood and appreciated, and for which we do have some physical evidence in the 12 tables that's to come.
Yeah.
That would allow us to sort of try and smush what we don't know about this period into that pattern of our understanding of governance that comes later on.
I think that's definitely what they're trying to do here. I think they're definitely trying to draw a loose parallel with what Greece, specifically, I shouldn't say Greece, what Athens has been through earlier. I think they're now putting that onto Rome as like a loose pattern of what is happening in terms of as exactly as you say, the cycles of what they're going through in terms of changes in government.
And this is the sort of thing that obviously Dionysius of Halicarnassus would be pretty invested in as a Greek writer for a Greek audience.
Yeah.
Being like, look at how Rome is kind of just like the baby Greece.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, they're going to grow up and they're going to be just like us.
Yeah,
we influence them from the inside out. Okay, so in terms of like the way that Dionysius structures this narrative, he really focuses in on, first of all, the consequences of the pestilence.
Mm-hmm.
How do they resolve the issue of the fact that there's nothing to harvest in this next year?
Tricky.
Yeah. Apparently they buy a lot of corn. Corn here means grain.
Yeah,
buying a lot of corn with public money, and some of it is bought with private money, so you've got some grain speculators operating in the market as well, bumping up the price.
Speculators, the worst.
Yeah, but you definitely need to buy food, so what are you going to do?
Exactly, yeah.
And they've also got a lack of meat as well from the flocks that they haven't been able to maintain because either the animals have died or the husbandmen have died.
Yeah.
So that's been a problem.
Sure, if the animals have all...
Yeah. You don't want to eat that meat.
No, as we have learnt again. There's a
don't
lesson
do
in
it.
there for you.
Don't do it, guys.
Yeah.
And they don't. But this means that everybody's a bit hungry. And also a bit weakened. And it's at this moment that the ambassadors come back from Athens, and I sort of see them as like, patrician, strutting in a bit of gold, here and there, and sort of like walking into a city that has been absolutely devastated since they last left it, being like, guys, we're back from our holiday. And everyone's like, we've
been dying. How are you?
Grain. Yeah. Did you bring any bread with you?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, guys, you look unwell.
I really recommend a vacay.
Yeah, have you thought about sunshine in the south? So this is a weird sort of narrative move.
Yeah.
And it seems just like they just come back. And apparently, now this is the thing that Dionysius tells us, is that they have come back from Athens and the Greek cities in Italy. So actually, like, they've done the trip that way. where
Which
they've gone down.
would make more sense, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's kind of, it makes more sense, actually.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
and maybe if you were clever, you never went to Athens at all. It's fine.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people doing law at the moment that you could have a chat with. It's fine. And then they're like, okay, well, it must be time to try and put all of this together. And this is where this starts to get complicated.
Yeah.
And they're like, how are we going to bring this all together?
Definitely.
Because we have this sense in which the consuls of this year are kind of like, don't want to make a wrong move here, but also we just became consuls.
Yeah. We don't really want to give up our power to other people.
And the suggestion seems to be that there should be this, group of 10 men, this decimvirs.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like, oh, so we'd have to step down? And everyone's like, well, yeah. And they're like, oh, I don't know if that's really in our jurisdiction, actually, because, we've just been given this majesty and everything. We have to hold it for a year. That's kind of like the law. And everyone's like, oh.
Speaking of the law.
Speaking of the law. Interesting.
Did you know that we're trying to write it down?
Yeah. And they're like, well, I'm not really sure if, and they're really trying to delay things because, and this is a bit of a patrician tactic in general that we have seen.
Absolutely.
So they are trying to delay things as well. But they're also they do have some leg to stand on in the sense that they're supposed to hold that majesty. They can't just cut it off themselves.
Well, hell, we've been waiting for over 10 years. What's another year?
Patience, my friend, makes it all the more sweeter.
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, what we should do is we should elect the magistrates for the next year.
Yeah.
That's what we should do.
Okay.
And we'll get that ball rolling.
Right.
But before they come into their magisterial power, they can consult with the Senate about maybe giving up that power for
as in
the group
how
of
they're
10.
supposed to give it up, or as in...
Yeah, so this is kind of where it gets hazy.
Right.
Because they're kind of like, actually, because we're already in our magistracy, we can't do this. We can't just step down.
Right.
What we can do is we can do our job and we can get the election happening so that there's some consul designates for next year, and we can do that /early so that then they can liaise with the Senate about what best to do instead of should they step into that majesty themselves or should they somehow build a different structure. But I think those consul designates for the next year should be the ones to do that, not us.
Sorry, I thought you meant they were holding elections for being decimvirs.
No. Yeah, no, they're pushing forward elections for the consuls for 451.
Gotcha.
Future year.
Yeah.
And this is weird. It seems a bit odd, and the tribunes are like, okay, let's see how this goes. Fair enough. And two front runners start to stand out. Mm-hmm. A guy called Appius Claudius.
Yep, that tracks.
Appius Claudius and Titus Genucius.
Whose name we have also heard before.
Yeah, so these are some figures that have come up for us before. Appius Claudius. Now, there is some controversy over which Appius Claudius we're actually talking about.
There's always some controversy about this because there's so many Appius Claudiuses.
They all have the same name.
Yeah, and they're often similarly disposed.
They are.
Yeah.
This Appius Claudius is the son of Appius, grandson of Marcus, Crassus, in Religionensis Sabinus.
Yeah.
Now, he seems to be possibly conflated with a previous Appius Claudius.
The consul of 471.
The consul of 471.
Yep.
But there's some quibbles that maybe this is the same Appius Claudius. Mm-hmm. He was quite a severe character.
He was, yes.
But there seems to be some narrative benefit and also some just mathematical benefit for this being that Appius Claudius's son.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is 20 years ago now.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's possible, but
also a little bit unlikely because...
Hey, there's just been a pestilence. I mean, come on. Yeah.
Who's dead? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
So we think it's probably the son. And this will become clear, why this might be a good theory later on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Titus Genucius, we're not really sure what's going on with the Genucii at this time. They seem to be a plebeian name.
Yeah, it's definitely a name we've heard before. I don't think we've heard of this guy before.
I don't think we've heard of this specific guy.
But I remember the name Genucius.
Yeah, and there seems to be some questions over whether this is a plebeian gens or a patrician gens, and actually this raises lots of interesting questions when we get to the decemvirs anyway.
Well, this is the thing that I'm grappling with my account, because as we constantly talk about, but you just can't not talk about it, there are just so many question marks about who are the patrician, who are the plebeians, how did this conflict of the orders come about, and who's on which side. I do admit I like the theory that it's dangerous to say that this is all one conflict of the orders and they have all the same goals all the way through and it's always the same groups, because it does last, spoiler alert, for a couple of 100 years. It flares up at certain times and dies down at other times, but realistically,
it's like a rash.
It is, yeah, it is. It is the rash that won't go away because penicillin does not exist. Basically. So yeah, it does make sense to me that the groups are going to change, what they're fighting for is going to change. I get that. But for you and I, in this time period right now...
It's very confusing.
It's so confusing because there are so many different theories about who these people are and what they're able to do. And
for the most part, we're just getting a list of names as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of these that we can cross-reference with the Fasti,
yes.
Which is great. But it doesn't actually help us understand anything about their characters or what their affiliations were.
And as I say, I've read so many different theories about who these people are. Like, some people see there being, basically, once the kings are out, some academics see that in the first couple of decades of the Republic, you've got this group who are the patricians who start to close ranks and do what we've been talking about before and be really quite a solid group in terms of defending privileges and what they have access to versus what other people have access to. And the plebeians therefore arise in reaction to the patricians. So the plebeians aren't a group that exist before the patricians exist.
Yeah, potentially people who are responding to those in power and actually would like a share of that power for themselves.
Yes.
And maybe quite independently successful in various other ways.
Exactly. And definitely there seems to be a lot of discussion about the fact that we've got to be careful about how we talk about the plebeians, because they probably are quite a diverse group. There probably are some people, as you say, who are in the city and are doing relatively well for themselves and aren't necessarily, completely without a certain kind of power, but they just don't have exactly what they're looking for. They're shut out of a lot of things, and therefore these well-to-do people are looking for a share in power versus the people who are rural, and they want a different thing. They want, obviously, a fairer cut of the pie, I suppose. They want things like land allotments and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there are probably different concerns going on here, and it's just so difficult to try and pull it apart, especially when you've got the layer of our sources being written so much later and after the Gracchi brothers and all that drama about land allotments and tribunes of the plebs and their powers. Like, it's just, it's so hard to pull this apart. I've read that many theories. My head is exploding.
Yeah. I keep reading, and it is a really fascinating period. And so in the sense that I think actually this might be a good point to actually wrap up this episode, actually, because things are about to get more complicated.
Absolutely.
Complicated.
The one thing I'm going to flag before we sign off, which is about the whole patrician plebeian divide. So I mentioned to you that when they agreed that they were going to have this decemvirate, this board of 10 with no other magistrates, and there was debate about who was going to evolve patricians, plebeians, because there is debate, as we've just flagged with Janucius, about whether plebeians actually did have more access to things like the Senate than we would be led to believe by accounts like Livy.
Well, and we have to keep in mind that our sources are quite elite sources.
Absolutely.
They're writing from a huge position of privilege, and it seems that there's a reasonable case to be made that even if because we have two decemvirates, that even if the first one is mostly patrician / all patrician, that the second one doesn't seem to be at all.
No.
The second one seems to be half and half of plebeian names and patrician names.
Which is bonkers.
But also would make sense.
It would make sense, but it's given the narrative.
Given the way that this narrative has been shaped, you're not expecting it. You're like, wait a minute.
Because the patricians, and this is what I mean about, as we've talked about often with our accounts, oversimplifying things and seeing things very much in terms of black and white, patricians, plebeians. There's obviously so much more nuance, and I think what we're heading towards right now is the tipping point where it's actually, this might be where the black and white comes from. when everything starts to be written down and codified,
Things become solid.
This might be where the black and white comes from. This might be where that patrician plebeian divide gets even sharper. Because there are real question marks in all the decades we've been talking about how much access to power plebeians actually have, and whether there is perhaps a bit more blending than we have been led to believe. But the reason why I'm interested in that right now for the first decemvirate, which we are pretty sure, at least our sources represent as wholly patrician, is because the plebeians do agree to this in my account. They say, okay, after arguing back and forth that plebeians should be on it, which, as you say, would totally make sense, they say, okay, we'll let you have all patricians. However, our conditions for that are that in this year where you're the only magistrates and there are no appeals, we don't want the Acilian law about the Aventine to be changed. We need that law kept in place, and all other sacred laws need to be kept in place. And we think this is a reference to the agreement about the tribune of the plebs, existing.
So you can't just delete the tribune of the plebs now that you've got the chance.
And the reason why I find that interesting is that some academics I have read have suggested that actually what we're seeing here is, and this would make sense given some of the things that have happened in some of the other episodes that we've talked about, that really this is the patricians, as we talked about, trying to really lock down on power. And one way of doing that would be to get rid of the tribunes who have risen.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And the Acilian law, again, the way that our accounts represented it, it seemed to be more about, sacred space, a temple to Ceres, something like that. But there are other accounts where actually this is maybe about, land being given to the plebeians, a bit of a land allotment thing, potentially, because it's a really unusual law to be named not after the consul, but after someone else. It's everything about it is so unusual. And the Aventine being, having that association with plebeians and that kind of stuff. We're not really sure what's going on here, but it's definitely clear that they're trying to dig in and make sure that all the progress they've won so far, whatever that progress is secure going into this new phase. So that's where I'll wrap up, Dr. G.
Oh, things to think about indeed.
Honestly, as I say, the more I read, the more I get confused about the patricians and the plebeians and this conflict of the orders. But I think that's I think
natural. It's par for the course with this kind of stuff, to be honest.
So, Dr. G, that means that it is once again time for the partial pick. Excellent. Igor's very keen today. My
the
goodness.
partial pick. All right, so I'll be trying to remember all the categories from the top of my head. Let's see how we go.
Military clout.
That's a big fat 0.
There is nothing going on. Yeah.
Yeah, so Rome is in contention for 50 golden eagles. They can score 10 in each category. There are 5 categories.
Yeah.
They so far are on the grand total of 0.
No. Nothing.
There is a citizen score.
You're skipping right to the end. I love it. Yeah.
So you remember you should say the categories then. I'm just saying what I remember.
We don't have to do them in order. That's all right. Citizen score. Okay, so we're doing 2 years together, which makes this a little bit tricky. On one hand, I think it would be absolutely terrible because you're living through a pestilence.
I think, we can only go up to where we've gotten up to in the episode. So we don't know what yet happens at the end of the year that we're currently in.
No. I actually am pretty much at the end.
I have no idea.
I mean, kind of. Yeah. I don't have a lot more. But I think that, first of all, there's a pestilence. Then there's famine. But there is actually finally something happening.
Hope on the horizon.
Yeah, there is a codification of the laws happening, which although you and I might take a bit of a cynical view about what that actually achieves, it is something.
It's pretty big.
I wouldn't, normally I would say 0.
But a lot of people have died, so I feel like it's got to be less than 5.
I agree. I think maybe 3?
3 sounds good.
Okay, cool. Diplomacy.
Not
really.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think we've gotten into the big negotiation phase. And actually, technically, to have a set of decemvirs who have absolute magisterial control and there's no recourse to appeal on the horizon.
It's kind of the opposite of diplomacy.
It kind of suggests that that's not really happening.
Yeah, okay, so nothing for that. Expansion?
Yep, that's a big fat 0 as well.
Yep, nothing. And then finally, virtus.
Oh, virtus. Has
Yeah.
anybody demonstrated virtus? I think Spurious Furious stepping in nobly as Suffolk consul and then sadly dying in the role is the greatest example of virtus that we've seen in this last session.
It's not really virtus at all.
It's not. No.
No.
Nobody
Oh my
nobly
God.
dies, that's
This
for
is
sure.
terrible, Dr. G. This is absolutely terrible. I'm wondering, in retrospect, now that we've already talked about
That's
it.
pestilence for you, isn't it? You can't score highly on a pestilence year.
No, I mean, yeah, this is terrible. It's 3 out of 50. 3 out of 50. I've got my calculator here, and I typed in one number.
It's a new low for ancient Rome.
Well, that's what happens.
That's not surprising. That's how I feel about this year as well, to be honest.
Well, this is the thing I was going to say. The only thing that we could maybe wrap up on is that this is a reminder that as bad as things can get when you're living through a pestilence, and as much as it might screw up your economy and God knows what else, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You will come out of it. The question is, how do you want to come out of it?
Yeah, what changes as a result of the coming out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for the Romans, they're actually finally doing something. I don't think those two things are connected, but
I mean, I don't want to flag the possibility that some Romans would read the pestilence as a sign that the codification of the laws really should not be happening at all.
No, and I don't think that, to be honest, the pestilence is the reason. I think it's just it's a coincidence. But
gods.
You can choose to rebuild your world in a better way. So build back better, people. Build back better.
Thank you for tuning in to this latest edition from the Partial Historians. It's Dr. G here, and I want to do a big shout out to all of our patrons on behalf of Dr. Rad and myself. So, without further ado, a huge thank you to Sean, Roman, Sharon, Joel, Tamara, Justine, Paul, Mark, CW, Teresa, Ensley, Savannah, Dana, Zara, Adri, Theodore, Gunnar, Jacob, Nick, and last, but never least, somebody call who has entitled themselves. Find someone who looks at you the way the Optimates look at public land. Thank you, as always, for your support. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed the show.